Today on the Take On Board podcast, I'm speaking with Diana Nestorovska about considering and managing geopolitical risk in the boardroom. Before we start the podcast today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record today. For me, I am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be listening today. I acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, skies, culture and country. I support Voice, Treaty and Truth for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and I encourage others in the Take On Board community to do the same. Now, let me tell you about Diana. Diana is Deputy Chair of South Gippsland Water Corporation, and she has previously been on the boards of Melba Support Services Limited, Sexual Health Victoria and the University of Wollongong University Council. She's also been a member of the Latrobe University Human Research Ethics Committee and a public representative on the Australian Press Council. As of yesterday, Diana is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and she brings 20 years of experience across law, diplomacy, enterprise risk and for-purpose leadership. She's a former Australian diplomat and has represented Australian interests in the United Arab Emirates, that's hard to say, and Qatar. Diana, welcome to the Take On Board podcast.
Hi, Helia. Thank you for having me.
So good to have you here. And, geopolitical risk, it was often on the kind of board conversations for global organisations, but hasn't always been on the board agenda for other organisations, but increasingly is. And we will dive into that soon. However, as always, before we dive into that, I want to dig a little bit deeper about you. Tell me, what was young Diana like, and when did you get your first inkling that you might end up in the boardroom?
I don't think I had an inkling that I'd end up in a boardroom. It just kind of happened.
Yeah.
So I was studying, I grew up in Wollongong. I went to the University of Wollongong and I was studying an arts law degree. And towards the end of my degree, it was probably around about 2003, an opportunity came up to run for a student representative position on the university's council, the governing body. I ran a campaign just as an independent student that was interested in representing the student voice on the governing body of the university, and I got up. I ended up serving on the council for 2 years, from 2004 to 2005, and it was during that time that I had the opportunity to study the company directors course for the Australian Institute of Company Directors. I ended up doing the exam for that course probably in 2006 after I finished up at Wollongong and started my career at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And it's I suppose it's served me ever since. I was just to answer your question about what was the young Diana like, and maybe to segue into how that all ended up moving me into a board career. So at the time when I was at university, I was doing a lot of different things. I had many different hats. I was on the university council. I really loved studying law. I just finished up my arts degree. I'd studied French, my undergraduate degree in arts, and paralegaling in Sydney at the time at a large law firm. So I was doing all sorts of different things and really enjoying wearing a lot of different hats. And then I ended up going off to Foreign Affairs. I entered into the 2006 DFAT graduate program. Through that program that I ended up being posted to the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. I had to do 2 years of Arabic language training for that posting. So that included 10 months based in Canberra studying Arabic, classical Arabic, and then another 10 months based in Jordan before moving across to the UAE. So then things happened. I met my husband in the UAE. He's from Melbourne. decided to move back to Melbourne, and I dusted off my law degree and started private practice at that time. And as often happens when you go through major life changes, I ended up going on maternity leave. I had my son, and it was during this time that I kind of rethought my career and what I really wanted to do. And I thought back to my time on the University Council, and I thought about the portfolio career that I had then and how much I just really enjoyed having diversity in my day-to-day life, in my day-to-day career. So it was around that time that I decided, okay, I was going to move into in-house legal practice rather than private practice. And then I wanted to test the waters and get back into non-executive directorships. And it was at that time when I had a 4-month-old. This is what happens. At a 4-month-old, I was having these sort of thoughts, and I thought, well, what do I want to do moving forward? How do I want to show up in my career? And that's when I looked back on the training that I'd received at the university, my company director's course, and an opportunity arose to join the board of, it was called Family Planning Victoria then, but it's now Sexual Health Victoria, and that's how I segued back into more of a portfolio career moving forward. So sorry, it's a bit of a long introduction.
Oh my goodness. I mean, so, in amongst your many skills, it sounds like juggling many balls is part of it, keeping lots of things moving in the air, which is, of course, incredibly handy for a portfolio career because you're often juggling all sorts of different things.
I think so, and I also think just having that unconventional career. I think a lot of your listeners might resonate with having a bit of an unconventional career. And it's only when you look back after 10 years or 20 years that you can see the threads that has sort of continued on your journey.
Yes.
So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But I think at its core, you've got to think about what you want to do, how you like to show up, what your interests are, and then try and build a framework around that in terms of your career.
Most definitely. Okay, so let's turn to our conversation today, geopolitical risk, what board directors might need to think about in relation to geopolitical risk. Where should we start? You're the diplomat, you're the DFAT expert. Where should we start this conversation?
Well, Helia, I think there's been a lot when you open up the AICD website or when you turn on the news, it seems like geopolitical risk and considerations of geopolitical risk are everywhere.
Yes,
and I think we need to bring it down to basics, at least insofar as board directors are concerned, because I often think when people hear about geopolitical risk, it often sounds abstract, like something that only diplomats or academics with PhDs in international relations really need to think about or are concerned about.
yes.
At least from my perspective, having been a diplomat and transitioned to a legal career and a non-executive director career, I really think that geopolitical risk is something that's deeply practical. And it's really about how political, economic, and social instability, or even outright conflict, can disrupt the environment in which organisations operate. So the term might not appear in your board papers, or it might not appear as geopolitical risk in your strategic risk register, but the reality does, and it shows up in real decisions, real disruptions, and real risks. So if you've ever had to think about supply chain changes, if you've ever had to respond to a cyber incident, if you've ever had to think about or pivot due to a sudden regulatory change, you've probably already dealt with geopolitical risk, but it just hasn't turned up in that terminology.
Totally. In fact, the other one I'm hearing for organisations is also just, heavy inverted commas, exchange rates and the impact on exchange rates and geopolitical risk and so on. Okay. So
that's a good segue, actually, Helia.
There you go. Look at me segueing away. All right, take us away.
I'm reading my notes because that actually segues nicely into what I wanted to talk about initially around, what is geopolitical risk and how does it manifest or how does it show up for board directors. So, I mean, the lawyer in me always loves a definition, right? So when I talk about geopolitical risk, I'm often referring to, these external forces that can impact how organizations operate, grow, or protect their people, assets, and reputation. And you can think about it as the intersection of politics, economics, and security, and how those dynamics emerge as risks to your business. So there's a number of different dimensions that might show up. And the first it's a bit of a classic, it's political instability. So regime changes, civil unrest, coups, things like that. So that's sort of one dimension. Another dimension, and it's related to political instability, it's conflict and war. So terrorism, border disputes, things of that nature. Now, tying back into what you'd mentioned earlier, Helia, around exchange rates, that's economic nationalism and economic factors are now increasingly a part of that geopolitical risk landscape. So when you think about protectionism, you think about sanctions, and you think about trade wars. So that's within that frame.
Dare I say the word tariffs?
Oh, we will come to that, actually. And then there's probably two more limbs that I'll mention before. I mean, I don't want this to be quoting statistics at you, but I'll just mention a couple of things at a high level. So cyber threats. I mean, every board director these days should have cybersecurity right up there on their strategic risk register. But you can also think about cyber threats as a component of geopolitical risk, particularly when you think about state-sponsored attacks and data sovereignty issues. So I'll quote something at you here. I mean, according to the Australian Signals Directorate Annual Cyber Threat Report 2024-2025, state-sponsored cyber actors continue to pose a serious and growing threat to our nation. So there is a component, there is an international component to that particular strategic risk when you're thinking about cybersecurity. And then finally, and this is important, I think, for those of us, or at least for me, insofar as my work is concerned on the board of a public utility, climate and resource pressures. So climate change, climate geopolitics, that's a key issue and a key component of geopolitical risk. And you're looking at things there like migration of peoples, water scarcity, energy politics. So those are, I suppose, the key spheres or the key ways in which geopolitical risk might show up. And you can see that it's not necessarily an abstract, singular concept, rather something that permeates.
And even so it'd be interesting to get your thoughts about, the risks are quite broad. There's a whole range of different risks. They're quite broad. So it'd be interesting to have a conversation then about the impacts of those. Because what I'm hearing is I can't think of it with what you've already mentioned. I can't think of an organisation that shouldn't be considering some of these things. I mean, cyber in particular, but any of it, supply chain risk, scarcity of resources, whatever it may be, whether it's the tiniest of the small local organisations or the biggest of the massive global organisations, there, I imagine, are going to be impacts for them. So, can you talk me through some of the impacts from these risks?
So, look, that's great, Helia, because I was thinking about how your listeners might be able to use a framework or to think how they might think about how geopolitical risk shows up for them. And there's probably two limbs here that I want to talk about. The first being organisations that might already be operating overseas or that might have significant interests, either assets or people or a supply chain that's internationally focused. So I suppose for those organisations, and this this might also apply to organisations that operate more domestically, but in general, for organisations that have significant interests overseas, the exposure to geopolitical risk is direct, and it can come up in a number of ways. So one way it can show up is operational risk. So disruptions to facilities, impact to staff. I mean, how do you protect your people if there is civil unrest in a volatile environment?
Yeah.
You know, these are some real OH&S employment issues for a director to consider.
Yes.
So that's just sort of one aspect for those that are operating overseas. You've also got regulatory risk to consider. So sudden changes in laws that can really impact your license to operate.
Yeah.
So if you're relying on a particular discretion being exercised by a local regulatory authority, or if there's political controversy around your right to actually operate in that jurisdiction for whatever reason,
yes,
and there's a sudden change in law or there's a sudden change in government, you may well find that, you know, you've got some real existential issues there that you need to consider about operating in that environment. I think probably also another component of regulatory risk, and increasingly so, particularly for those organisations that are very much organisations that are involved in tech and innovation, you've got to think about things like export controls and data sovereignty issues, particularly if you're dealing with anything that's sensitive in nature or that might have a dual use for defence applications. So that cuts both ways. I mean, Australia in and of itself also has its own export control regime for certain types of technology. So that's probably an area I think that some organisations might need to do a bit of a deeper dive on.
Yes.
In case there's any changes to the regulatory environment there. You've also got reputational risk, which is I would say it's one of my favourite risks to consider. As a lawyer, you know, regulatory risk is up there in terms of what I really like to focus on. But I think this is probably something that there's a couple of components to this for those operating overseas, one of which is, who are you doing business with overseas? Who are you associating with? Who are your partners?
Yeah.
You know, if there's associations with people who or organisations that may have a particular controversy surrounding them, that might certainly shine a spotlight on your operations overseas, but also within Australia, you know, within the media framework within which we operate. Then there's also things like modern slavery that we need to really think about, and that's irrespective of whether or not the Australian legislation and the reporting requirements apply to your organisation. Because I really do think, you know, irrespective of what legal obligations might apply to an organisation, you've still got to think about, from that reputational perspective, ensuring that your supply chains are free of forced labour, and really understanding where your goods, you know, where your goods and services are coming from.
Yeah.
So those are sort of critical reputational and compliance issues. And then finally, just for this particular cohort of organisations, financial risk.
Yeah.
Yep. So there's a number of things I think that you can think about if you are doing business overseas. There's currency volatility, particularly during crises, capital flow restrictions, frozen assets, sanctions, so not being able to process payments and increase compliance costs, but also thinking about divesting assets if necessary, if those assets are located in areas that may well be the subject of sanctions. And it's quite complex. It's not just Australian sanctions that organisations need to worry about, but there's a patchwork of sanctions from other jurisdictions that may well operate and affect your operations. And then, of course, there's things like insurance costs. I think every organisation in Australia has probably been dealing with insurance costs that have increased as a result of global volatility. And whether you know it or not, you probably are dealing with some kind of financial ramification of an international situation. So I'll pause there for international operations before moving on to sort of domestic organisations, if you've got any questions.
Well, look at us go. We're in flow. I was actually going to ask about, because your board experience is more local, obviously. So I'd be interested to hear how geopolitical risk has shown up for you in the boardrooms that you've been in, how it's shown up, what it looks like, and what you've done about it, I guess. Yeah, is there any stories you're able to share?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll keep it at a high level, and there's probably three ways that I've been thinking about geopolitical risk, insofar as my own board career has been concerned. So I did mention earlier about climate change and climate geopolitics as being a key component of that geopolitical risk paradigm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I am on the board of a water board, a public utility. And I suppose, when you zoom out and when you think about it, climate geopolitics and energy transition are driving tensions. Lack of access to clean water is a significant driver of instability and conflict. In many parts around the world, it results to enormous harm to human health and is a driver of conflict and migration of peoples. Now, how does that high-level global risk translate into what I do on a day-to-day basis as a director? Well, I suppose it shapes up in the way in which I think about my mission and I think about my purpose on that board. And it really is about ensuring that, in order to have thriving communities must have access to clean water. I know we take it for granted in Australia when you turn on the tap and clean water comes out and, you flush your toilet and you go and water your garden, as long as there's no water restrictions. We take it for granted that we have access to these kinds of resources. But in many parts of the world, that's not the case. Yeah. So in order for us to have a thriving community, and in the context of climate change, where you've got increased extreme weather events, potentials for drought, you've got to think about how can you build resilience? How can you build resilience for your community? How can you build resilience in terms of the infrastructure that you build as a public utility? And so a lot of these issues go into the planning of your capital works program, right? Where you're going to build treatment plants, how are you going to supply growing towns and growing regions? How are you going to make sure that communities continue to thrive because they have continued access to a critical service? So that's one framework or one way in which the global becomes local. And you wouldn't necessarily think about it, right? But you can see the logic in terms of how it flows down into what you do on a day-to-day basis, at least insofar as I'm concerned on a water board.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I was giving a very wry smile there when you said how it flows down, and I was thinking about water. So that was my very tiny...
Thank you for calling that out.
So I got slightly distracted by that. My apologies. That is far from the most important thing in what you just said, but it's what, people might have seen me go, oh, and that's what I was thinking. Anyway, yes, it is. But it's such a great example of how, the world, see, now I'm going to use the word flow as well, how those big issues can flow into small, not smaller, but local organizations, and how, the many different ways in which they can impact upon each other. It's a really great example.
Well, I've got another example, and I think this one's quite interesting. Given a lot of the debate that's happened in certain overseas jurisdictions, I'm going to be very diplomatic in terms of how I
You are a former diplomat after all. Fair enough.
But I mean, you can see, in my board career, I have been involved. I have been a director of an organisation that is very much about the provision of sexual health and reproductive services, and Family Planning Victoria, now Sexual Health Victoria, does provide these services. And sometimes I think global debates around Planned Parenthood, for example, in certain jurisdictions can be quite polarising, or indeed have been quite polarising for a long time, and especially in recent years, when you've seen the US Supreme Court decision, for example, in Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
So, I don't need to sort of labour the point in terms of saying that these kinds of issues, yes, they do happen, or these kinds of debates do happen in overseas jurisdictions, but those debates and those sentiments, you just don't know how they might translate across the borders into Australia and into our context. So I think in those circumstances, thinking about how community sentiment may shift, or thinking about how policy might shift as a result of community sentiment, particularly in the social media age, is something that certain organisations might need to think about. In planning what if scenarios, and I'll probably get to that a bit later in this segment around what boards can do. But that's just a great example about how a community-focused health organisation may well need to think about a broader global debate in terms of potentially responding to shifting sentiments in the community. Oh, you're back.
What are the key things you want people to take away from the conversation that we've had today?
Thanks, Helia. I think, from my perspective, boards play a vital role in anticipating and responding to geopolitical risk. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. The first is to think about integrating geopolitical risk into governance. And so you make sure it's a part of the enterprise risk register, but you don't necessarily need to call it geopolitical risk or have a standalone geopolitical risk item on the agenda. You can think about how international events might materialise in the other risks that you've got on your register. So cybersecurity is a classic example of how you can integrate these considerations. I don't know to the extent to which some of your listeners might be involved in critical incident management scenarios and scenario planning with management. But you could ask management how geopolitical scenarios are considered in planning, and you might include an international component to the exercises that you conduct, so that you can really have those, what if scenarios and think through some of the ramifications and implications of a geopolitical issue that impacts your board or your operations. You can think about board capability and whether or not you need to augment board capability to consider geopolitical risk. And a simple way of doing that, you might build board literacy, for example, by incorporating briefings. That's one way you can do that. The third way is to consider how geopolitical events might affect your stakeholders and come up with a stakeholder engagement strategy or contingency planning. So you think about how those events might affect employees, customers, investors, or other stakeholders. Consider where you've got employees located. Consider where your assets and supply chains are located. And also consider comms. If geopolitical events do arise, as an organisation, this is a consideration for each individual board. Are you going to make particular statements around those issues, or are you going to remain neutral? These are some of the things to think about. And then finally, I think one of the most, one of the most important considerations. I mean, I say that because I practice in my day job is to practice as a lawyer, but due diligence is quite important, particularly for those organisations wanting to move a component of their operations overseas. So I can't stress this enough. When you are operating internationally, you are not doing business in Australia. There are different laws, there are different cultural norms, there's just different ways of doing things, and you really need to engage local advisors to help you, to provide advice, to monitor shifts in sentiment and regulation, and to really help you navigate that complexity. And then finally, I think going back to one of the topics I'd mentioned earlier, it's really doing due diligence on who you're doing business with on the ground. Who are your partners? Are they aligned with the regime? Are they politically exposed? Is there anything that might in that relationship that might come back to bite you from a reputational perspective, for example? So those are just some of the key takeaways for your listeners, and hopefully just some practical considerations moving forward.
Fantastic. Okay, well, maybe it's picking up on the capability part of that suggestion. Are there any resources you would like to share with the Take On Board community?
There are so many resources out there, Helia. I really don't know where to begin. So I take it back to first principles and just say, look, from a high level and from a global perspective, it does make for, I have to say, it does make for bleak reading, but the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2025 is a great place to start in terms of sort of those key geopolitical risks at that global level. Some of the key risks identified include state-based armed conflict, extreme weather events, and geo-economic confrontation. At that high level, big picture, that's a good resource. Sort of narrowing down and looking at our region, I always think think tanks like the Lowy Institute do produce some really great publications to give listeners a feel for the issues that affect our region and Australia's place, in the Asia Pacific. So there's a lot of publications available online. Your readers can go to the Lowy Institute website. Oh, your listeners, sorry, Buffy, can you assist with that one? Then I think DFAT country briefs. This is a great free resource on the DFAT website, where if there's a particular country that you're interested in, whether out of curiosity or if you want to do business or expand operations there, the DFAT country briefs give a great overview of the political context, the economic profile of the country, emerging issues, and the depth of our bilateral relationship with that country. So great resource, free resource available online. And then finally, from a governance perspective, and really, for the day-to-day practicing director out there, AICD has a wealth of resources, articles online and through the Director magazine around geopolitical risks and just some of the key issues that have arisen in recent times. So those are sort of 4 key resources. Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, fantastic. Starting point for people in thinking about these things. Oh, Diana, thank you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom about geopolitical risk with the Take On Board community today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure others watching and listening have also learned a lot. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Helia. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the time.